Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Alright, peoples. It is Wednesday. And today Joe has picked a very important day in history. As a usual. But this one, I think, affects and impacts us all. No matter what our preferences are or where we live. Today is the March on Washington and the Martin Luther King speech. I have a dream. My dream is more acceptance. Let people do what they want, as long as it's not affecting you. And you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, before we get back to serious topics, let's do a little less serious topic. That's what I wanted to do. We're going to have a race. I think we're going to do a people race. Because today's topic is about people. Let's see. Running. Let's do a running race. Alright, so we're running both sexes. Oh, here we go. Start. There we go. Alright. So we got Mountain Inspirations. We got She Stole. We got everybody together and I can't see anybody. There's JB. I think that's Zombie. Oh, no, that's Zool back there. Who else do we got? Martin. Oh yeah, Turtle. We got Eric. Jared. Bluegrass. Tramps. Luscious. Oinya. TNT. Traveling Van. There's Goat. There's Juices. There's Jericho. There's Mark. Jacob. Susan's coming from the back. One Busy Mama. There's Judy May. There's Gorilla. There's Net. Mayhem. Nacha Daily. Oh, somebody from the... Oh, it's Gorilla. Hold on. Okay, it's changed to the Gigi Show, which is a lot shorter. A lot easier to say. He's a comedian, magician, artist, and thespian. And as you can see, he's got some regular videos, different types of shows and comedy and warfare. And we've got some shorts here, which are, I'm going to guess, parts of games, little skits. And then, of course, the comedy show. This is the ones that I usually catch, are the comedy shows. So those, that's your thing. Check them out, like, share, comment, and have a good day. Alright, Mr. Bearded Historian, tell them something interesting.
Well, this is the anniversary of an event that happened about 61 years ago, August 28th of 1963. Now, African Americans were legally freed from slavery under the 13th Amendment and granted citizenship with the 14th Amendment, and then given elevated status as citizens and full voting rights by the 15th Amendment in the years soon after the end of the Civil War. But Democrats would regain power after the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877 and put down many restrictions on people of color in the South. At the turn of the century, southern states passed constitutions and laws that disenfranchised most black people and many poor whites, excluding them from the political system. Kind of like, I'm going to slam the door and you're going to have no chance. Well, the whites would impose social, economic, and political repression against black people in the 1960s in a system of legal discrimination known as the Jim Crow laws, which were pervasive in the American South. Black people suffered discrimination from private businesses as well, and most were prevented from voting, sometimes through violent means. 21 states actually prohibited interracial marriage. Well, during the 20th century, they had a little change up. Civil rights organizers began to develop ideas for a march on Washington, D.C. to seek justice. Early efforts to organize such a demonstration included a march on the Washington movement in the 1940s. A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and president of the Negro American Labor Council and vice president of the AFL-CIO, was a key instigator in 1941. With Bayard Rustin, Randolph called for 100,000 black workers to march on Washington in protest of discriminatory hiring during World War II by the U.S. military contractors and demanding an executive order to correct this. Well, faced with a mass march scheduled for July the 1st, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued the Executive Order 8802 on June 25th. The order established the Committee on Fair Employment Practice and banned discriminatory hiring in the defense industry, leading to improvement in many defense workers. Randolph would call off the march. Well, Randolph and Rustin continued to organize around the idea of mass marches on Washington. They envisioned several of them during the 1940s, but all were called off despite criticism from Rustin. Their prayer pilgrimage for freedom, held at the Lincoln Memorial on May 17, 1957, featured key leaders like Adam Clayton Powell, Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins, and Mahalia Jackson would perform. Well, the 1963 march was part of a rapidly expanding civil rights movement which involved demonstrations and nonviolent direct action across the United States. 1963 marked the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln. Leaders represented major civil rights organizations, members of the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, put aside their differences and came together for the march. Many whites and black people also came together in the urgency for change in the nation. That year, there were several violent confrontations that would break out in the South. In Cambridge, Maryland, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Goldsboro, North Carolina, Somerville, Tennessee, St. Augustine, Florida, and across Mississippi. In most cases, white people would attack nonviolent demonstrators seeking civil rights. Many people wanted to march on Washington, but disagreed over how the march should be conducted. Some called for the complete shutdown of the city through civil disobedience. Others argued that the civil rights movement should remain nationwide in scope rather than focus its energies on the nation's capital and federal government. There is a widespread perception that the Kennedy administration had not lived up to its promises in the 1960 election, and King described Kennedy's race policy as tokenism. Well, usually. May 24th, 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, name sounds familiar, invited African-American novelist James Baldwin, along with a large group of cultural leaders, to a meeting in New York to discuss race relations. However, the meeting became antagonistic as black delegates felt that Kennedy did not have an adequate understanding of the race problem in the nation. The public failure of the meeting, which came to be known as the Baldwin-Kennedy meeting, underscored the divide between the needs of the black Americans and the understanding of the Washington politicians. But the meeting also provoked the Kennedy administration to take action on the civil rights of African Americans. On June 11, 1963, President Kennedy gave a notable civil rights address on national television and radio, announcing that he would begin to push for civil rights legislation. That night, early morning, June 12, 1963, Mississippi activist Medgar Evers was murdered in his own driveway, further escalating national tension around the issue of racial inequality. After Kennedy's assassination, his proposal was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Well, Randolph and Rustin began planning a march in December 1961. They envisioned 2 days of protest, including sit-ins and lobbying, followed by a mass rally at the Lincoln Memorial. They wanted to focus on joblessness and a call for public works program that would employ black people. In early 1963, they called publicly for a massive march on Washington for jobs. They received help from Stanley Aronowitz of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. He gathered support from radical organizers who could be trusted not to report their plans to the Kennedy administration. The Unionists offered tentative support for a march that would be focused on jobs. On May 15, 1963, without securing the cooperation of the NAACP or the Urban League, Randolph announced an October Emancipation March on Washington for jobs. He reached out to union leaders, winning the support of the United Auto Workers, Walter Reuther, but not of the AFL-CIO president, George Meany. Randolph and Rustin intended to focus the march on economic inequality, stating in their original plan that the integration in the fields of education, housing, transportation, and public accommodations will be of limited extent and duration so long as the fundamental economic inequality along racial lines persists. As they negotiated with other leaders, they expanded their stated objectives to jobs and freedom to acknowledge the agenda of groups that focused more on civil rights. Well, in June of 63, leaders of several different organizations formed the Council of United Civil Rights Leadership, an umbrella group to coordinate funds and messaging. The coalition of leaders, who became known as the Big Six, included Randolph, chosen as the head of the march, James Farmer, president of the Congress of Racial Equality, John Lewis, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Roy Wilkins, president of the NAACP, and Whitney Young, president of the National Urban League. King in particular had become well known for his role in the Birmingham campaign and for his letter from Birmingham jail. Wilkins and Young initially objected to Rustin as the leader of the march, worried he would attract the wrong attention because he was gay, a former communist, and a draft register.
Well then.
Or resistor. They eventually accepted Rustin as deputy organizer on the condition that Randolph act as lead organizer and manage any political fallout. Well, about 2 months before the march, the Big Six broadened their organization coalition by bringing on the board 4 white men who supported their efforts. Walter Reuther, president of the UAW, Eugene Blake, former president of the United Council of Churches, Matthew Amann, the National Council of the executive director of National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice, and Joachim Prince, president of the American Jewish Congress. Together, this Big Six plus 4 became known as the Big Ten. John Lewis later recalled, "Somehow, some way, we worked well together. The 6 of us plus the 4. We became like brothers." Now, June 22nd, the organizers met with President Kennedy, who warned against creating an atmosphere of intimidation by bringing a large crowd to Washington. The civil rights activists insist on holding the march. Wilkins pushed for the organizers to rule out civil disobedience and described this proposal as the perfect compromise. King and Young agreed. Leaders from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality, who wanted to conduct direct actions against the Department of Justice, endorsed the protest before they were informed that civil disobedience would not be allowed. Final plans for the march were announced in a press conference on July 2nd. President Kennedy spoke favorably of the march in July 17th, stating the organizers planned a peaceful assembly and had cooperated with the Washington, D.C. police. Now, mobilization and logistics were administered by Rustin, a civil rights veteran and organizer of the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, the first of the Freedom Rides to test the Supreme Court ruling that banned racial discrimination in interstate travel. Rustin was a longtime associate of both Randolph and Dr. King. Longtime associates of these two, along with concentrating on building the march's political coalition, Rustin built and led the team of 200 activists and organizers who publicized the march and recruited the marchers, coordinated the buses and trains, provided the marshals, and set up and administered all of the logistic details of a mass march in the nation's capital. During the days leading up to the march, these 200 volunteers used the ballroom of the Washington, D.C. radio station WST as their operation headquarters. Now, a couple things to realize. This is way before a lot of our mobile technology existed. I mean, most of your phones were attached to walls, but they had ways of getting the word out. You know, there were underground papers. A lot of letters were written. A lot of information was passed, you know, around from church to church, from business to business. And if all else failed, you know, sometimes a person would just get out and go for a drive, take the information with them. Now, the march was not universally supported among civil rights activists. Some, including Rustin, who had assembled 4,000 volunteer marshals from New York, were concerned that it might turn violent, which could undermine the pending legislation and damage the international image of the movement. The march was actually condemned by Malcolm X, spokesperson of the Nation of Islam, who termed it the farce on Washington. Now, march organizers disagreed with the purpose of the march. The NAACP and the Urban League saw it as a gesture of support for the civil rights bill that had been introduced by the Kennedy administration. Randolph King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference believed it could raise both civil rights and economic issues to the national attention beyond the Kennedy bill. Both groups, CORE and the NSCC, believed the march could challenge and condemn the Kennedy administration's inaction and lack of support for civil rights for African Americans. Now, despite their disagreements, the groups came together on a set of goals: the passage of meaningful civil rights legislation, immediate elimination of school segregation. The Supreme Court had ruled that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education. A program of public works including job training for the unemployed, a federal law prohibiting discrimination in public or private hiring, a $2 an hour minimum wage nationwide, equivalent to $20 in today's funds, withholding federal funds from programs that tolerate discrimination, enforcement of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution by reducing congressional representation from states that disenfranchise citizens, a Fair Labor Standards Act broadened to include employment of areas that then excluded, authority for the Attorney General to institute injunctive suits when constitutional rights of citizens are violated. Although in years past Randolph had supported Negro-only marches, partly to reduce impression that the civil rights movement was dominated by white communists, organizers in 1963 agreed that white and black people marching side by side would create a more powerful image. The Kennedy administration cooperated with organizers in planning the march, and one member of the Justice Department was assigned as a full-time liaison. Chicago and New York City, as well as some corporations, agreed to designate August 28th as Freedom Day and give workers a day off. Now, to avoid being perceived as radical, organizers rejected support from communist groups. However, some politicians claimed that the march was communist-inspired, and the FBI produced numerous reports suggesting the same. In the days before August 28th, the FBI called celebrity backers to inform them that the organizers' communist connections and advising them to withdraw their support. When William C. Sullivan produced the lengthy report on August 23rd, suggesting that communists had failed to appreciably infiltrate the civil rights movement, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover rejected its contents. Strom Thurmond launched a prominent public attack on the march as communist and singled out Rustin in particular as a communist and as a gay man.
Yee.
Organizers worked out of a building in West 130th Street in Lenox in Harlem. They promoted the march by selling buttons featuring two hands shaking and the words "March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom," a Union bug, and the date August 28th, 1963. By August 2nd, they distributed 42,000 of the buttons.
That's a lot of buttons.
Yeah, their goal was to reach at least 100,000 people. Well, as the march was being planned, activists across the country received bomb threats in their homes and in their offices. The Los Angeles Times received a message saying that its headquarters would be bombed unless it printed a message calling the president a nigger lover. Charming. 5 airplanes were grounded on the morning of August 28th due to bomb threats. A man in the Kansas City telephoned the FBI to say he would put a hole in between the king's eyes. The FBI did not respond. Roy Wilkins was threatened with assassination if he did not leave the country. Now, Thousands would travel by road, rail, and air to Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, August 28th. Marchers from Boston traveled overnight and arrived in Washington at 7 a.m. after an 8-hour trip, but others took much longer bus rides from cities such as Milwaukee, Little Rock, and St. Louis. Organizers persuaded the New York's MTA to run extra subway trains after midnight, and in New York City, bus terminal was busy throughout the night with peak crowds. A total of 450 buses left New York City from Harlem. Maryland police reported that by 8 a.m., 100 buses an hour were streaming through the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel. The United Automobile Workers financed bus transportation for 5,000 of its rank-and-file members, providing the largest single contingent from any organization. One reporter, Fred Prowledge, accompanied African Americans who boarded 6 buses in Birmingham, Alabama, for the 750-mile trip to Washington. The New York Times carried the report. The 260 demonstrators of all ages carried picnic baskets, water jugs, Bibles, and a major weapon, their willingness to march, sing, and pray in protest against discrimination. They gathered early this morning in Birmingham's Kelly Ingram Park, where state troopers once, 4 months previous, used fire hoses and dogs to put down their demonstrations. It was peaceful in the Birmingham Park as the marchers waited for the buses. The police, now a part of a moderate city power structure, directed traffic around the square and did not interfere with the gathering. An old man commented on the 20-hour ride, which was bound to be less than comfortable. "You forget we Negroes have been riding buses all our lives. We don't have the money to fly in airplanes." John Marshall Kilimanjaro, what a heck of a name, a demonstrator traveling from Greensboro, North Carolina, said, contrary to the mythology, the early moments of the march, getting there was no picnic. People were afraid. We didn't know what we would meet. There were no precedents. Sitting across from me was a black preacher with a white collar. He was an AME preacher. We talked. Every now and then people on the bus would sing, "Oh, freedom, and we shall overcome." But for the most part, there wasn't a whole bunch of singing. We were secretly praying that nothing violent happened. Some bus rides actually would feature racial tension as black activists criticized liberal white participants as fair weather friends. Hazel Mangle Rivers, who paid $8 for her ticket, 1/10 of her husband's weekly salary, was quoted in the August 29th New York Times. Rivers said she was impressed by Washington's civility. "The people are lots better up here than they are down south. They treat you nicer. Why, when I was out there at a march, a white man stepped on my foot and he said, 'Excuse me,' and I said, 'Certainly.' It's the first time that ever happened to me. I believe that was the first time a white person had ever really been nice to me." Now, some participants who arrived early held an all-night vigil outside the Department of Justice, claiming it had unfairly targeted civil rights activists and that it was too lenient on white supremacists who attacked them. Now, the Washington, D.C. police forces were mobilized to full capacity for the march, including reserve officers and deputized firefighters. A total of 5,900 police officers were on duty. The government mustered 2,000 men for the National Guard and brought in 3,000 outside soldiers to join the 1,000 already stationed in the area. These additional soldiers were flown in on helicopters from bases in Virginia and North Carolina. The Pentagon readied 19,000 troops in the suburbs, and all of the forces involved were prepared to implement a coordinated conflict strategy named Operation Steep Hill. Now, for the first time since Prohibition, liquor sales were banned in Washington, D.C. Hospitals stockpiled blood plasma and canceled elective surgeries. Major League Baseball canceled 2 games between the Twins and the last-place Washington Senators, although the venue, the D.C. Stadium, was nearly 4 miles from the Lincoln Memorial rally site. Now, Rustin and Walter Fauntleroy negotiated some security issues with the government, gaining approval for private marshals, with the understanding that these would not be able to act against outside agitators. The FBI and Justice Department refused to provide preventative guards for buses traveling through the South to reach D.C. William Johnson recruited more than 1,000 police officers to serve on the private force. Julius Hobson, an FBI informant who served in the March's security force, told the team to be on the lookout for FBI infiltrators who might act as agent provocateurs. Jerry Bruno, President Kennedy's advance man, was positioned to cut the power to the public address system in the event of any incendiary rally speech. Now, the organizers originally planned to hold the march outside the Capitol building. However, Reuther persuaded them to move the march to the Lincoln Memorial. He believed the Lincoln Memorial would be less threatening to Congress and on the occasion would be appropriate underneath the gaze of President Abraham Lincoln's statue. The committee, notably Rustin, agreed to move the site on the condition that Reuther pay for a $19,000 sound system that everyone on the National Mall could hear the speakers and musicians. Rustin pushed hard for this expensive sound system, maintaining, "We cannot maintain order where people cannot hear." The system was obtained and set up at the Lincoln Memorial, but was sabotaged the day before the march. The operators were unable to repair it. Fauntleroy contacted the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, and the Civil Rights Liaison, Burke Marshall, demanding that the government fix the system. Fauntleroy reportedly told them, "We have a couple 100,000 people coming. Do you want to fight here tomorrow after all we've done?" The system was successfully rebuilt overnight by the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Now, the march. Now, the march would command national attention by preempting regularly scheduled television programs as the first ceremony of such magnitude ever initiated and dominated by African Americans. The march was also the first to have its nature wholly misperceived in advance. Dominant expectations ran from paternal apprehension to dread. On the Meet the Press, reporters grilled Roy Wilkins and Martin Luther King Jr. about widespread foreboding that it would be impossible to bring more than 100,000 militant Negroes into Washington without incidents or possibly rioting. Life magazine declared that the Capitol was suffering its worst case of invasion of jitters since the first Battle of Bull Run.
Ooh.
The jail shifted inmates to other prisons to make rooms for those arrested in mass arrest, and with 1,700 extra correspondents supplementing the Washington Press Corps, the march drew a media assembly larger than the Kennedy inauguration 2 years earlier. Students from Berkeley came together as Black Power organizations and emphasized the importance of the African American freedom struggle. Their march included black political parties, and William Worthy was one of the many who led college students during the freedom struggle era. On the 28th, more than 2,000 buses, 21 chartered trains, 10 chartered airliners, and uncounted cars converged on Washington. All regularly scheduled planes, trains, buses were also filled to capacity. Now, although Randolph and Rustin had originally planned to fill the streets of D.C., the final route of the march covered only half of the National Mall. The march began at the Washington Monument and was scheduled to progress at the Lincoln Memorial. The demonstrators were met at the monument by speakers and the musicians. Women leaders were asked to march down Independence Avenue, while the male leaders marched on Pennsylvania Avenue with the media. Now, the start of the march was delayed because its leaders were meeting with members of Congress. To the leaders' surprise, the assembled group began to march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial without them. The leaders met the march at Constitution Avenue, where they linked arms with the head of the crowd in order to be photographed leading the march. Got to get a good image out there.
Right.
Marchers were not supposed to create their own signs, though this rule was not completely enforced by marshals.
What?
Most of the demonstrators did carry pre-made signs available in piles at the Washington Monument. The UAW provided thousands of signs that, among them, read, "There is no halfway house on the road to freedom," "Equal rights and jobs now," "UAW supports Freedom March," "In freedom we are born, in freedom we must live," and "Before we'll be a slave, we'll be buried in our grave." Now, interestingly enough, about 50 members of the American Nazi Party staged a counter-protest and were quickly dispersed by police. Should just let them beat the heck out of them. The rest of the Washington March was quiet during the march. Most non-participating workers stayed home. Jailers allowed inmates to watch the march on TV. Now, representatives from each of the sponsoring organizations addressed the crowd from the podium at the Lincoln Memorial. Speakers included the Big Six, 3 religious leaders from the Catholic, Protestant, Jewish faiths, and labor leader Walter Reuther. None of the official speeches was by a woman. Now, dancer and actress Josephine Baker gave a speech during the preliminary offerings, but women were limited in the official program to a tribute led by Bayard Rustin, at which Daisy Bates also spoke briefly. Floyd McKissick read James Farmer's speech because Farmer had been arrested during a protest in Louisiana. Farmer wrote that the protests would not stop until the dogs stopped biting us in the south and the rats stopped biting us in the north. Now, the order that they went through on, first of all, Liz Randolph, then Daisy Bates, Dr. Eugene Carson Blake from the United Presbyterian Church, John Lewis, the chair of the SNCC, Walter Reuther of the Union of Auto Workers, AFL-CIO, Floyd McKissick from CORE, Rabbi Uri Miller from the president of the Synagogue Council of America, Whitney Young, the National Urban League, Matthew Amann of the NCCIJ, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Rabbi Joachim Prince from the American Jewish Congress, and finally, Martin Luther King Jr., the doctor, had his speech, the I Have a Dream speech, would become celebrated for its vision and eloquence. Closing remarks were made by Randolph and Bayard Rustin, march organizers, leading with the pledge and the listed demands. Now, when it all was said and done, it was quite a piece that Martin Luther King Jr. put together. It called for the end of racism in the United States and invoked the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States Constitution. At the end of the speech, Mahalia Jackson shouted from the crowd, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." The king departed from his prepared text for a partially improvised peroration of the theme of I Have a Dream. Over time, it has been hailed as a masterpiece of rhetoric added to the National Recording Registry and memorialized by the National Park Service with an inscription on the spot where King stood to deliver that speech. And it, just reading it is one heck of a piece. And, it's been saved, both in, if I remember, Library of Congress has it. I still have a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. One day, this nation will rise up and live to its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I have a dream. But that was pretty much one of the high points of the civil rights movement, and it would start turning the gears that we needed to bring this nation together. It still has a lot of work to do, but at least they made the foot forward. So, this has been the Bearded Historian, folks. You folks have a good week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.